Hey, what's up, 8th graders? These are your Eco 6 Cycles of Matter notes. This is just part 1 on page 12 in your Ecosystems Lab notebook. We are going to be talking about how different elements or sometimes compounds cycle through the environment. So in this set of notes, we're talking about the carbon cycle and the oxygen cycle, but all of these listed here are examples of biogeochemical cycles. And that just means how a chemical substance, usually an element, but sometimes it's a compound, such as water, moves through the biotic and the abiotic parts of an ecosystem. So through the living things like plants and animals, but also through the non-living things like the atmosphere, water, and the earth. So first we're going to talk about the carbon cycle. Carbon is an element that's found in every living thing on Earth. Plants, animals, the atmosphere, and even fossil fuels are all part of the carbon cycle. The carbon cycle is just the continuous movement of carbon between the living or the biotic factors and the non-living or abiotic factors in the environment. So in this section, we're going to be talking about what are some sources of carbon, which means where carbon is being released into the environment. And then we're also going to talk about some things that use carbon. An important thing to note about the carbon cycle, too, is that it's not always just the element carbon floating around free by itself. A lot of the times, it's combined with other elements, such as oxygen, to make carbon dioxide, or methane, which is CH4. So the first thing I want to point out about this diagram is that there are a lot of arrows. You need to pay attention to which way the arrows are pointing. If the arrows are pointing towards an object, like the tree, that means that the tree is taking in or using the carbon. And then in this example here, where the arrow is pointing away from this fallen or dead tree, this means that the tree is releasing carbon back into the atmosphere. So a few different things that we see tied to carbon. We know that plants and animals are part of the carbon cycle. Trees, for example, plants take in carbon dioxide. They breathe it in the process of photosynthesis. It's what they start with in the process of photosynthesis. We also know that people over here release carbon dioxide when they breathe through respiration. We breathe out carbon dioxide. Some other sources of carbon are actually livestock, which would be cows and stuff. They produce methane, which is CH4. And then also agriculture, so growing crops and farming. It uses or it takes in carbon dioxide, as you can see from this arrow, through the process of photosynthesis, but it also produces oxygen. It lets out that oxygen, and it also releases CH4, which is methane. Methane is another one of those greenhouse gases that can contribute to global warming. So we really want to be careful with how much methane we are releasing into the environment. We also know about fossil fuels. We just talked about fossil fuels in our energy unit. We know that fossil fuels are made from the ancient dead remains of plants and animals. Plants and animals were once living things, which means they contain carbon. So after millions of years and lots of pressure and time, we have these deposits underneath the earth of coal, oil, and natural gas, which are all remnants of living things. So when we dig up those things and we burn them for electricity or for heat, we are releasing that carbon back into the atmosphere. It combines with oxygen in the form of carbon dioxide. And again, we know that carbon dioxide is another greenhouse gas that contributes to global warming. So we really want to be mindful and careful of how much of those fossil fuels we're burning and releasing into the environment, because it's having a detrimental effect on the earth in our atmosphere. Some other sources of carbon are deforestation. So when we cut down trees or other just plain animals and plants die, during that process of decomposition or decaying, those once living organisms that contain carbon are releasing the carbon back into the atmosphere. We know also that the process of photosynthesis helps us a little bit with the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, because in the beginning of photosynthesis, we take in carbon dioxide. However, the amount of carbon dioxide that we're also releasing back into the environment is unbalanced, which is, again, why we have the issue with global warming. Okay, that is the carbon cycle. Now we have the oxygen cycle. So oxygen is constantly being used and created by different processes on Earth. Oxygen is in our atmosphere. It's in the air that we breathe every day. It is in water, H2O, and it's actually the most common element in the human body. The oxygen cycle is very interconnected with the carbon cycle, as we just saw when we talked about the carbon cycle. Carbon is often combined with oxygen to create carbon dioxide. So one thing I'm going to point out about this diagram are all these little captions, because these captions contain really important information about the uses and sources of oxygen on Earth. And again, this process is just the cycling of oxygen through the biotic and the abiotic factors in an ecosystem. So where does most of oxygen come from? As you notice up here, it says most of the available oxygen comes from photosynthesis from plants on land and phytoplankton on the Earth's surface. Or on the ocean surface rather. So phytoplankton are actually really, really tiny little plants that just kind of float on the top of the ocean, and they are a huge contributor to the amount of oxygen that we have here on our planet. So it's not only the plants that are on land, but also those phytoplankton that are in the ocean are producing a lot of oxygen for us. A little known fact actually about oxygen is that oxygen is also made in the atmosphere. Sometimes there's a chemical reaction where sunlight breaks down water and releases oxygen. And there's actually a lot of oxygen on our Earth that is unavailable for use. We can't use it right away because it's actually tied up in the crust of the Earth, into the rocks and the minerals, and it just can't be released for our use. What is oxygen used by? Oxygen is used by a ton of different things. We, as people and animals, breathe in oxygen. But oxygen is also used in the decomposition of dead plants and animals. Bacteria use oxygen, and some bacteria even make oxygen. We cannot have fire without oxygen. You have to have a fuel source and heat, but you also have to have oxygen in order for fire to be created. And we know that we've talked about way back in chemistry the process of oxidation, when, for example, a metal is exposed to oxygen and it creates rust. All of those things are processes that use the element oxygen. All right, I think that's it, guys. Don't forget to answer the questions that are in your notes that go along with both the carbon and the oxygen cycle. Thanks for listening.